I squirm at these healing stories because of how the biblical text often views a person with a disability. Either a person with a defect to be pitied, or as inspiration porn, where a disabled person's life is flattened into what Dr. Leona Godin summarized recently as a saccharine narrative about overcoming adversity, usually designed to make non-disabled people feel uplifted and grateful. This text comes awfully close, but doesn't quite do either, since Bartimaeus, who is blind, sees who Jesus actually is more than Jesus' disciples. Jesus asked Bartimaeus the same question that he just asked of his disciples in the text immediately preceding this one, the story that we heard from last week. What do you want me to do for you? The disciples had responded to that question by asking for status and privilege, something Jesus says he doesn't have the authority to grant. But Bartimaeus asks for vision. The disciples seek additional power for themselves. Bartimaeus throws off his cloak, his one valuable possession that beggars of his time used to spread in front of them, and ask for alms. Bartimaeus understands who Jesus is, not because he's blind so much as because his blindness in this cultural time displaces him from insider status. It pushes him closer to the margins. And the text wants us to see that people who live closer to the margins often have an easier time recognizing God's power and our own need to be transformed better than those who believe they already have what they need. And while I wish that this text had ended with Bartimaeus asking for the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I do love how Jesus doesn't assume anything about what Bartimaeus wants or needs. The worldview of the text assumes that blindness is a defect, but Jesus does not. He asks Bartimaeus what he wants and listens to his response, and I love that about Jesus. He's in the business of granting release. And though Jesus tells Bartimaeus to go on his way, Bartimaeus, filled with gratitude, chooses instead to follow Jesus on his way. Michelle and I have been preaching through the stewardship season on habits of faith. The habits of faith in our lives that roughly correspond with the movements of our liturgy each week, our order for worship. Liturgy is a word that means simply the work of the people. And our order for worship serves as a kind of template for how the Christian community is invited to live our faith all of the time. Gathering, hearing and proclaiming the word, responding, sending, feasting, and celebrating. Today we respond to God, to the Word in flesh, and that response is out of gratitude. Now you can argue that responding to Jesus doesn't really require gratitude. In fact, we don't really know Bartimaeus' motivation or his emotional state. One can follow Jesus out of obligation, but I think that produces hard people who lack the mercy that Jesus offers. It's also less sustainable because at some point, people who do something out of obligation expect something in return. Instead of responding to a gift, they are responding to a deal with an expected return, like the two disciples who want to sit at Jesus' left and right. But what Jesus is offering isn't a return on an investment. It's the ability to experience life as it was intended. A gift given, undeserved, very good, and best relished in the company of others who understand their lives the same. Gratitude is at the heart of the Presbyterian version of faith. In fact, it's why I chose to become a Presbyterian in the first place. Many, perhaps most versions of the Christian faith emphasize the choices that we as human beings have to make in order to receive God's salvation, God's saving, God's wholeness. So Catholicism teaches that we are saved by participating in the sacramental life of the church. And Baptists teach that we are saved through confessing Jesus as Lord and Savior. I don't in any way wish to denigrate these other branches of our Christian family tree. Their theological foundations are sound. They make sense. I just concluded along my own journey of faith that many versions of the Christian faith include fear as a motivator, mostly the fear of not being saved. And fear is not the kind of motivation that I could finally accept in describing a God who chooses to die for people who deny, betray, and crucify him. If we are made whole, it is out of God's choice to love us, which you can see in Jesus listening to Bartimaeus while the crowd is trying to silence him. God will choose to grant Bartimaeus his request, yes, but God's attentive love for him is what is most significant in this text. Bartimaeus then responds by following Jesus, not in order to gain God's love, but knowing that God's love has already been granted to him, a state of gratitude which comes after a gift has been received. Responding out of gratitude is one of the best parts of being human. A wonderful state of being, and one that is less attainable if you are wealthy or otherwise entirely self-sufficient. Like the disciples who want to sit on Jesus' left and right, our culture works very hard to encourage us to chase after self-sufficiency. And yet Jesus encourages us to embed ourselves more deeply in community and in the relationships that form the church. This is the best protection, not only from dire poverty, but also arrogance that ends up creating scapegoats and enemies, welfare queens, and other myths that are used to make some people feel not gratitude, but entitlement. It's hard to be grateful if you actually believe that you are self-made, which no one on the history of the planet has or ever will be. We were all given something, even if it was not much more than milk and food to keep us alive. Gratitude is very difficult if you see yourself as more than you actually are. Gratitude can also be especially difficult for people in my line of work, since we are supposed to be preaching a gospel of grace that clearly understands every single human being to be fallible and prone to sin, while simultaneously expected to appear as though we are neither fallible nor prone to sin. It is much easier to experience gratitude if you are blind in a culture that excludes people who are blind from the category of normal, or poor in a culture that penalizes the poor for their own poverty. You are less likely then to see success as disconnected from the actions of others, good or bad. Now, most people I know go through periods of ingratitude that seem to blind them to the blessings in their own life and numb them to the needs of others, mixed with periods of gratitude where they feel deeply loved by God and loved by others. I think that's why I resonate more with the crowd in this text than with Jesus or Bartimaeus. When Bartimaeus cries out in the beginning of the text, many sternly ordered him to keep quiet. Their own sense of well-being outweighed their sense of compassion and empathy. And yet later in the text, when Jesus makes clear his intent to see this man, the same crowd encourages Bartimaeus. Sometimes we see others as God sees them, and sometimes we do not. Sometimes we treat those in need as obstacles in our way, and other times we treat them as we all are, people in need of grace. A couple of weeks ago, my 17-year-old daughter showed up around curfew time late at night. "Dad," she said somewhat breathlessly, "I need your honest feedback on a decision I just made." Here we go, I thought to myself. She gave me permission today to share some of our conversation. She went on to explain that night that coming down North Avenue in West Baltimore on her way home, she stopped at a light where a man who appeared to be homeless asked if she would give him a ride to the gas station. Cognizant that she was a teenage girl alone, he assured her that he would not try to get into the cab of the truck she was driving. He would just climb in the back. After sizing him up, she told him she'd be glad to give him a ride and he could just get in the cab. So what do you think, Dad? Was that a good decision? I told her honestly that night, I don't ever want my teenage daughter letting any stranger in her car. And yet she had met someone in their need, granted him what he had asked, treated him as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. How could I take issue with that? Later, when I encouraged her to reflect on this decision through writing, I learned that her real motivation was not out of guilt or obligation, but in her words, seeing myself in his story for reasons that are hers to share. It was compassion that connects, not out of pity, but out of solidarity. I think this is how Jesus responds to Bartimaeus and to every human being, not out of pity, but out of solidarity, recognizing that all human beings are at some level in the same boat. And when we see ourselves in others who are in need, rather than using their neediness to distance ourselves from them, we are better able to experience gratitude for the many gifts that God grants to our world each and every day. We are better able to lift up the prayer that one of our Bible study participants requested this week. Thanksgiving for the many things that are going right in our world and right in our lives. That's the opportunity that the church offers each of us at stewardship season. It's the opportunity to share out of our gratitude. Sure, some of us may share out of obligation or as a fee for service. I pay and get my weekly live music allowance of preaching and cut rates on funerals and weddings. And the church will accept those gifts as it will any other. But my experience is that when I give out of obligation or as a fee for service, my gifts, financial and otherwise, are usually puny in relation to what I am actually capable of sharing. And I rob myself of the great release of gratitude-based giving, which is total recognition that my money isn't my money. And my time isn't really my time in the sense of ownership. It belonged to God before I decided what to give, and it will go on belonging to God regardless of what I decide to give. That is a frightening notion if you see God as some kind of tyrant. But when you realize that God is in the business of giving gifts, granting mercy and release, you are much less fearful in your living, much more gracious in your giving, and much more connected to other human beings out of your shared need rather than through condescending pity or obligation. That has been my experience these last several years. You know, going through a divorce is an emotionally wrenching experience, and and it's also often financially destabilizing. The first year, I had to contact the chair of our stewardship committee, Taylor Stewart, and explain to her that I had no idea if I'd be able to complete my pledge, and I'd have to wait a bit to make a pledge for the following year. For someone who is very accustomed to being in control, this kind of vulnerability was excruciating. But Taylor told me what would be true for me for much of this period of vulnerability, that while I was down, others would step up. This is what a community does for each other, she told me. Solidarity, not pity. And the truth is that more vulnerability in my own life opened me in significant ways to the humanity in others, within and beyond our congregation. Not only did I relate more to the needs of others, I saw much more clearly the gifts that God seems to deliver, sometimes out of thin air. Like the crowd around Bartimaeus that day, and like Christy testified to us, I saw more gifts in the world and in my own life than I had seen before. I saw more people on the margins and the gifts that God was in the business of granting. Though I had less, I actually realized I had been given more. I could see more than what I had seen before. A universe awash with gifts, created by a God who loves nothing more than granting mercy and release. Amen.